For our last session of today, we have emerging audit hot topics. What's under the spotlight with Kim Melville-Smith and Brigette Pfister? Pfister. There we go. So please welcome Kim and Brigette. It's been a long day, so keep it lively for us, okay? Feel free to have fun.
Mission accepted. Okay. Hi, and welcome to our incredibly exciting presentation about audit hot topics. I'm Brigette Pfister. I'm the Financial Compliance Manager, and co-presenter, you already know, Kim Melville-Smith. Tell us about you, Kim.
I'm tired at the end of this day too. So Kim Melville-Smith, the Director of Post-Award here in the Office of Sponsored Programs.
Awesome. All right. So today we are going to talk about a few things. We're going to start with audit basics, what an audit is, when you should start preparing for audits, risk assessments in order to be prepared for your audit, and what to do when you're being audited. So let's get started. This is our dear friend, Benjamin Franklin. You may recognize him. He has a very famous quote from 1736, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." And that's especially true for research administrators. We would much rather be proactive and prevent the audit finding than have to respond to one. So let's talk about audit basics. Kim, do you want to take them through the basics of what an audit is?
Sure. So really the audit basics, it's there's kind of two different things. There's the audit, and then you can have different types of findings. So an audit is the official inspection of the accounts, typically by an independent body. And it's often conducted by either an internal audit department, a CPA firm, sponsoring agencies, OIG. The purpose of the audit is to ensure the accuracy and compliance. They basically test our internal controls, and we'll look at internal controls here later in the slide deck. But basically, the internal controls are the process the institution puts in place to prevent fraud and to ensure the integrity of its financial information. So the audit is really asking us how good we are at our internal controls. Like, that's what they're going to test against. Do we have things in place? And are we following the things we have in place? You've heard of audit findings, but what is an audit finding? So the audit finding is a comment on the design or the effectiveness of your internal controls. So are they well designed? Are they working? Are they poorly designed? Are they not working? Is there some variation between? Those are very kind of black and white things, but we know there's this whole gray area. And a significant deficiency is a problem with the internal controls that's less serious than a material weakness, which is less likely to directly impact financial statements, but it's still important enough to merit attention because it could lead to material weakness down the road. So if you've seen our CSU's audit in the past couple of years, we have had some significant deficiencies, which is rare for us. But again, this is part of that whole process. Is we found something that needed to be fixed, and so we're working through that process. And then a material weakness is an internal control problem that is likely to impact the financial statement, and problems could not be prevented or detected quickly. Material weaknesses could point to active fraud or a potential for it. Different auditors use different terminology, but the purpose and the outcomes are basically the same. And so it can get complicated really quick. And I'm going to keep it as simple as possible for now, but we definitely welcome questions if you wanting to kind of understand some of the nuances as we go forward. There's also a desk review, and the purpose of the desk review is to just an overarching appraisal of an institution's award administration. It's paraphrased from NSF. I didn't actually read it all to you verbatim, but that's basically what NSF says. And then again, the desk review is looking at, can you successfully manage, and are you following your internal controls?
Okay, so if you reach a point where you have an investigation, that's a little different from just a regular audit. So an investigation is a specific inquiry to uncover facts and identify potential wrongdoing. That means they have reason to suspect that there's something nefarious going on. We don't see those very often for good reason. The purpose of an investigation is to determine whether crimes have been committed. And these may result from audit findings or from anonymous reports, whistleblowers, that kind of thing. But it's important to understand what the difference is there. We will all eventually get desk reviewed, and at some point we're all going to be audited. We're audited annually, but hopefully none of us will be the subject of an investigation like ever in our careers. That would be awesome. Let's do that. We're going to talk about how to successfully pass your desk reviews and audits, even though the investigations are the most interesting. Sorry about it. We don't have any of those. Thank goodness. Okay, so here's a question for you. When do you begin preparing for an audit? Does anybody have a guess? Before it starts, Sam, that is correct. At the submission stage. I love it. Always, yes. You guys definitely have the right idea at the pre-award stage when we're actually starting the project. If you receive a notice that your institution's been selected for an audit, is that the time to begin preparing? Well, obviously, we know that's not the time. The best time to start planning for an audit is at the award stage. So really, you could start preparing at the proposal stage, like a lot of you have said. But if you're involved with research administration for any amount of time, you're going to hear the phrase begin with the end in mind. So in a perfect world, we would have a big enough team and more than enough resources to devote to dotting every I and crossing every T, but the reality is most of us don't. It's almost impossible to be perfect. And even if you manage that, there's auditors out there who feel that they haven't done their job until they found something, even if it is something minor. The objective, though, for us is not perfection, but preparedness. So if you can't possibly ensure that everything is perfect and you haven't got enough resources to devote to audit readiness specifically, how do you determine the best use of the resources you do have? Well, that's something that we have talked about a bit. And we talked about risk-based audit preparation. So what this means is that you're taking an approach to risk that is with the idea of putting the most resources toward mitigating your most serious risk at your institution. So you look at what the highest risks are overall, the most common findings for similar organizations and/or your biggest sponsors, and then you can determine what the highest risks are for us here at CSU. So how do you determine what your biggest risks are? Well, that's something that requires risk assessment. You can start by looking at the most common audit findings, like I said, for your favorite sponsors and for similar organizations.
I'm going to go ahead and address Chris's question really quick that she put in the chat. And she asked if there is a comprehensive resource for CSU's internal controls. And the answer is no, there is not a comprehensive resource. So usually, generally in the audit, they will ask for specific documentation on specific policies and procedures. So through the process of having to do many, many audits, OSP has pulled the information together. And generally, we just provide links to the resource on CSU's website or whoever owns it, because very rare does OSP actually own our internal processes and our internal controls. So we do generally just point to the actual resource during the audit.
It's a great question. I wish we did have them all in one place. That would be so easy to use. Okay, so there's many materials and methods for conducting our risk assessment. I like the simple ones myself. We need to first look at the current landscape. So what's going on in the field? There's a lot going on in the field right now, isn't there? What are other institutions dealing with, and what are the most common audit findings and consequences and outcomes for those? You can find this information in several ways, and you're doing one of them right now, attending sessions and asking questions of your network. You can also check out websites like oversight.gov, the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and the individual agency OIG, that's Office of Inspector General sites, to review actual audit reports. I recommend NSF. They are very standardized and to the point. Those audit reports are really easy to read, and you can tell what they're talking about and why. I really like those. You can see responses from the auditees and more. There is a slide at the end of this presentation that has some links for you so that you can actually go out there and look at some of that information yourself. So we're going to look at some of the external factors that we all need to be aware of for just a minute. So we're looking at the current landscape. We're looking at emerging issues and the most common or serious findings. So once you have a good idea of what those issues are, you're going to compare our practices with those and identify gaps. So we have internal assessment that needs to happen. So where are our gaps? How are we doing on this thing that gets regular findings out there in the field? Do we have policies and internal controls in place to deal with those issues? And what about our people? Are our people aware of what our procedures are? And are they doing things the correct way every single time? And I know that can be a challenge for all of us when we have more work to do than we have time to do it. So are our personnel following our policies and procedures, and are they adequately trained? And do they know where to find the information and the tools they need to uphold the internal controls that we have? So basically what that means is it doesn't help to have a policy if nobody knows about it and nobody follows it. So that can also be a fairly common audit finding. You'll see if you go out there to the OIGs and look that an organization is not following their own published policy. You'll also want to check out the COSO Cube. It's linked at the end of the presentation to learn more about internal controls. It's a really cool framework that's been developed to sort of show you where internal controls intersect and stuff. It's really fun if you're a nerd like me. Okay, so then you have to figure out which of your gaps or risks are the most serious. And one way to do that is to use what I call a risk matrix. And here we go. It's nice and colorful for one, because I like to make things nice and colorful. You can make one of these in Excel on your own computer and then color code your risks according to this slide to quickly identify which things that you might want to focus on. So basically the way this works, you're looking at impact. If this thing happens, how big of a deal is it going to be? You've got low, medium, and high. Then at the top, you have likelihood. How likely is it that this thing is going to happen? So for example, let's say somebody is charging an unallowable cost to a grant project. Well, what is the likelihood of that? Well, it depends, right? So, but it's fairly likely that we're going to have something unallowable charged at some point. Maybe it's an accident, probably it's an accident. So what's the impact of that? Well, that also depends. Your sponsor may go nuts over that if they see it. So that may be a high impact. It may not. It may be something that if you have internal controls in place, you're going to catch it the very next month when you do a reconciliation and you're going to move it. And so then it would be low impact. So all these things are it's sort of a gray area like everything in research administration, but this is one way to be able to quickly assess. So things that are blue are things that are unlikely to happen and would have a minimal impact if they did. And these are typically acceptable risks that are going to require minimal monitoring. So low risk things, these are the green. Those things are not expected to have a significant impact on the project or objectives. They might require some simple mitigation strategies or periodic monitoring. Now, when you get into yellow territory, that's when we have to start really thinking about the risk associated with something. These are risks that could potentially impact the project or objectives, but are manageable with the proper strategy. So these are things that warrant regular review and specific action plans. When you get to orange, those are a big deal. So those are things that are likely to occur and would have a considerable impact on the project. They require immediate attention and detailed mitigation plans in order to manage them effectively. Then when you get over here to the very high risk, the red, there's a reason why stop signs are red. These are the highly likely to happen things that would have a severe impact on the project or objectives. And these things are urgent and they could require significant resources to mitigate. So for example, we talked about unallowable costs being charged to a grant. How likely is it that we're going to have something unallowable post to an award? I'd say that's medium to high, because while we have controls and policies in place, depending on where you are, there's always errors, misunderstandings, occasionally a bad actor. They're very far and few between, but I've seen it in my career. So what is the impact of charging an unallowable cost? Well, that could be high, like we said, because of the financial implications that can be kind of significant, including required repayment of funds, penalties, administrative burden of resolving audit findings. And additionally, there's a reputational risk that can affect future funding opportunities and the institution's standing in the research community. And that means this might be in the yellow-orange territory, or it could even be considered high risk, which would be orange. So we need to make sure that we have solid internal controls, sufficient training for the faculty and staff who are going to be handling this, and clear communications, which all of that would involve regular monitoring and review for unallowable costs, which we have here at CSU. Yay! Again, there are a lot of tools for evaluating and prioritizing risk. But why is this important? Well, because there's consequences. So let's look at some examples. Kim, do you want to take them through some of the examples of audit issues?
Yes, you know I love the examples. This is my favorite part. So as Brigette has mentioned, most of our examples are NSF, and that is not because NSF has more findings than any other agency. It's just that their reports are really easy to find, they're easy to read, they're easy to digest. And so the information is just easier to disseminate than some of the other agencies. So this one, you have the slides. So the name of the institution is listed on the notes part of the slide, but we're going to not talk about which institution these are because we try not to shame anybody in this process. It's all about learning. So this institution had 1.2, basically 1.25 million in question costs in this March 24 audit. What I do want to make clear for these audits is that the audit report came out in March of 2024. However, these are generally 5-year windows that they're looking at. And so while the finding came out in March of 2024, it could have been transactions all the way back to like 2019 and stuff like that. So these are oftentimes over a time period when we do these audits. It's not just that year. But we always list them in what month and year the findings came out. So it was 1.1 million for an unallowable fixed amount subaward, and then 77,000 of inadequately supported expenses, 28,000 of unallowable expenses, and 20,000 of inappropriately applied indirect and fringe benefits. So the thing to note about the inappropriately applied indirect and fringe benefits, almost always that ties back to unallowable expenses or inadequately supported or some other concern that happened at the institution or with the subaward. I think it's in a different one that we'll talk about the consequences to an institution for their failure to monitor a subaward. So this one specifically was a non-compliance with federal requirements for pass-through entities, non-compliance with their own policies. So what this one was, which was really fascinating to me, is that 1.1 million for unallowable fixed amount subaward. It was a prior approval to submit to issue a fixed price subaward. However, it exceeded the simple acquisition threshold, which is at the time $250,000. So they did not follow the simple acquisition threshold, which is required for fixed amount subawards. And they didn't think they needed to because they had prior approval for the 1.1 million subaward. It was, I mean, that's how they submitted it to NSF and that's how it was awarded. So that's where the non-compliance with federal requirements for pass-through came in. And then the inadequately supported expenses and unallowable expenses and stuff really did kind of factor in the non-compliance with their own policies. So the one thing to really note on this one is that you'll see that the university only paid back $126,000 out of the 1.2 million. So they were able to argue, and I say argue, and it's not a negative argue, it's we consider these more conversations, but they disputed, it's probably the better term, that fixed amount subaward was approved and it was allowable and it should have not been one of the findings. So they, through the negotiation process, they came to agree to pay back the $126,000 to NSF. So, and I think we talk about it later, but this is, again, these are conversations. Just because there's findings doesn't mean you have to pay everything back. So we'll go to the next example.
Okay.
This is one from May of 2024. I didn't talk about it, but in the last one, but I'll mention on this one. So this audit, they selected 42 transactions for totaling $1.9 million. And out of all of that, only $41,000 came up in questioned costs. So there's those unallowable expenses, unallowable costs associated with indirect rates not adequately applied or appropriately applied, and then inadequate supported expenses. So this one happened to be an IPA, an Intergovernmental Personnel Act. So really what that is if for those of you who don't know, federal agencies will often hire our faculty or whoever to do work for them. So NSF often does that. That's how they get a lot of their scientific review people that work for them. So it's kind of it's an assignment at another institution. So NSF in those cases pays Colorado State University for that person's time and effort while they're working for NSF. So what happened with this one is that the IPA wasn't established appropriately. And this one I forgot, but I'm pretty sure there was a time difference between what their salary, what they told NSF the salary was and what their salary really was. And then indirect and fringe were charged on top of those indirect or incorrect amounts, which is where the unallowable costs associated with indirect came into be. So a lot of this is it's kind of like a chain reaction. You have this one thing and then it moves on to it adds these other things. So it's really just that unallowable piece kind of gets all this other stuff going. So again, as you can see, the university agreed to pay $33,000 back. So again, not the full amount of the question costs, but part of it, well, a good chunk of it in this case. So next one.
Okay.
This one is finally one that we have from HHS. And again, it was May of 2024. So this one was that they exceeded the salary cap for 3 calendar years. So that was one issue. Another was that the PI salary increase was contingent on the retention of external funds. So that's in violation of the institutional based salary. That's part of uniform guidance. And then supplies were transferred that did not meet federal requirements and travel costs that were not documented. So during that review, this one also had financial conflict of interest concerns. So while that's not a like money thing necessarily, that was part of this audit sampling. So they looked at the 35 individuals that were charged to this award, and they couldn't verify that 7 out of 14 key personnel had completed the required FCOI training. And then they couldn't verify that 9 of the 14 completed the required FCOI disclosure form. So again, HHS has pretty clear standard requirements that training be done every 4 years. And then depending on the FCOI at your requirement at your institution, they couldn't confirm that these people had submitted one in the time required. So unlike NSF, HHS is a little bit less clear on what the actual payback was. So the OIG requested a payback of $73,000. We do not actually know if the university agreed to that value or not. But it kind of gives you the scale of what their findings were and what they requested to be paid back. So this one specifically, they had selected 92 transactions to review for the financial findings, which was only $143,000. But really it was the FCOI stuff that really was different than what we generally see with like NSF, because they just don't have the same requirements that HHS does for FCOI.
Sorry, there. I want to note one thing. So you notice in all of these, there are costs that were not adequately documented or not properly supported. A lot of times people have questions about what is adequate support. And you talk about receipts and sometimes email threads and proper justifications and why that's important for every single transaction on a 5-3 account. And I think Kim made a good point earlier that your auditor is coming in sometimes 5 years after the fact, when the PI's retired, all the staff that were here and handled the original transaction are gone. Sometimes there's nobody at the institution who knows what actually happened. And so that support is really important, particularly considering that the average auditor is not a disciplined expert, does not understand the research, and is coming in to look specifically at the documentation that exists. So that's why it's so important for us to hammer that home and make sure we have it every time.
Bridget, I was gonna mention just that if you see that this was all finally rectified in May of 2024, and the 3 years of salary that they were looking at was 2017, 18, and 19. So making sure that you document.
Absolutely. Okay. Kim, do you want to continue with the more serious examples?
Sure. Okay, so these are some big ones. I can't say that this is what normally happens, but these are definitely some bigger ones that will catch your attention. So one institution had to pay $1 million to settle claims that it did not properly account for certain rebates and credits received on purchases it made on federal awards. So if we order a piece of equipment and there's a like mail-in rebate, which, you know, I love those as a personal consumer, that rebate needs to go back to the project that bought the purchase. That is not a slush money for the department. It's not available for free money. It needs to go back to the same account or accounts that made the original purchase. So another had to pay $801,000 to settle a claim that a professor falsified documentation for a federal award. I don't remember all the details behind this one. I apologize to remember what the falsification was, but common for this is, you know, I purchased this slushy machine to make really good ice for my test tubes to sit in. I'm totally making up stuff, but again, like, it's got a business purpose. It seems like it could be whatever's, but it really was sitting in his basement bar for margaritas. Like, that's a falsification. That can be one of these falsifications. That is not this example. I know that, but it's what's coming to my head. Another paid $10 million to settle claims that it improperly charged NIH grants for effort that was not related to grant activity. So, oops, I skipped one, but we'll go back. So again, like, if you charge somebody to an award and there is nothing in the RPPR about that person and what they did and how they benefited the project and what work they did for the project, that is improperly charging the grant for their effort. It was the $3 million to settle HIPAA violations because a person lost a USB and laptop, which were unencrypted, that had private information on patients. While we are not a medical institution, we do still work with sensitive data, and so we need to be very careful with that. And it's not just the suits that the individual or the individuals could file against the institution. It could also lose, we could lose federal funding because of that violation as well. So we've talked about these have consequences. So even something kind of small and simple really still can have some significant consequences. So some of the consequences that can happen is follow-up testing and or increased scrutiny, including from other agencies. So NSF says we didn't do this, but our payback to NSF was only $25,000. Well, NIH might come in now and look at the same kind of thing. And oh my gosh, that's a $3 million payback. So we just really don't want them finding anything big that gets other agencies questioning our ability to manage our awards. Corrective action plans. So if we find something, we could be required to submit a corrective action plan. And again, I've alluded to the fact, not alluded, but I've said that we've had a significant deficiency on our annual audit for the past few years, and a corrective action plan was put in place for that. And so we're about done with that plan and completion of that plan. We could be required to pay back costs. And I know, like, once we've spent the money, it's not that the university has a cash pot just sitting around waiting to pay back all these costs. This money has to come from somewhere. Disclosures to sponsors, which may impact future funding. Our current significant deficiency in our audit has caused a lot of consternation and a lot of extra work for our office over the past few years, even though it does not touch sponsored programs at all. But because it is an institutional finding, it does require some extra work and some disclosures. So far, our funding has not been impacted, but it could. Impact on institutional reputation. You know, we love having CSU in the news for really positive, amazing things. We do not want to be in the news that we mishandled or did anything nefarious with federal funding or any funding. But I mean, think about it as a taxpayer. If you saw that somebody was using your tax money to buy your slushy machine for your basement, I mean, it doesn't go well. You don't want that. And then finally, legal actions, fines, or penalties. And this is kind of where the investigation part can come in a bit more. And so legal action and fines and penalties could be to the institution, but it can also be to the individual depending on what happened. So we're here to keep the institution safe and help guide people. But at the end of the day, sometimes people just have their own opinions and want to do their own thing. So we're here to help minimize that, but we can't necessarily resolve all of that.
Let's talk about the external factors that we were discussing when we looked at risk assessment. Now that we are sufficiently terrified, these are the most common audit findings and thus the biggest areas of risk for most of us. And we have the meme is from my favorite movie of all time, Office Space. I'm dating myself, but I love that movie. Anyway, so the first one is, of course, unallowable expenses. Well, how do unallowable expenses make it onto our grant accounts? Do we have the controls or monitoring in place to keep this from happening or to identify and remove them if they do get on there? The second one is inappropriately applied indirect cost. So examples of inappropriately applied IDC is, for instance, let's say we have participant support costs or equipment on our grant and we charge indirect costs on them. We maybe charge them to the wrong object code so that they get IDC applied, and maybe we don't notice that. Maybe we've miscalculated somewhere, or we've accidentally used total direct cost when we should have used modified total direct cost, or vice versa. So when we don't read the award carefully regarding when the rate changes mid-award, we can get ourselves into trouble pretty quick. And if we don't catch it, that can be difficult. The third one is one we've already talked about a little bit, and that is inadequately supported expenses. So examples of that might be we don't have receipts, we don't have justification, or we don't have adequate justification, or we don't have evidence that a certain expense or a certain effort that was charged actually benefited the project. Those things can be a really big deal, as we've seen. Then we have non-compliance with policies and procedures. So if the institution has policies and procedures that are outdated and or inaccessible, or employees haven't received proper training, then we can also get findings because we don't follow our own published policies. If people can't read something and they can't find it, or they're not aware of it, then while they're not necessarily at fault for not following something that they haven't been informed of, we are still as an institution on the hook because that's our policy and we're not following it. So it's really important. And finally, we have insufficient subaward monitoring. So it's really important that we keep an eye on what our subawards are doing and monitor them adequately. Are we documenting that we're doing so? That is another audit issue that came up at one of the conferences that I attended, and they talked about how their staff at this institution had a really good method for doing the initial risk assessment for a subawardee and for monitoring them, but they didn't actually have a process to document that they had done so. So after the fact, when an auditor would come in, they wouldn't be able to tell. So they wouldn't know. Another important thing here is if we identify a problem with a subawardee, do we have a plan for how we respond and how we correct the problem? It's not enough just to do these things. We have to document them as well, which takes a lot of time and frankly, mental effort, because it is, believe it or not, sometimes a creative endeavor. Someone that I was corresponding with just this week said that justifications are very much like storytelling. And I loved that because it's very true. You have to be able to make it easy to understand. And you have to make your procedures easy to understand as well. So
hold on, I want to add one thing.
Oh, yes, please do.
So monitoring, the subaward monitoring and inappropriately applied indirect cost go together, which is kind of interesting. So if we are giving money to University Q and they charge indirect on the whole piece of equipment, even though it should have only been on the 5, on whatever's, That's our finding. That's CSU's finding. That is not University Q's finding. So really, like, we do need to be monitoring all of that, because no matter, again, what happens at University Q, when we're giving them the sub award, is not their finding. That is CSU's finding. And so to me, that's a little bit kind of hard to wrap my head around. It's like, I'm not sitting at the desk at University Q. I don't know what all their stuff is. I don't know how they do everything. And that's where the subaward monitoring comes in. And that's why it's so important to actually understand and be confident with what's going on at that institution or that entity.
So let's talk about some low-hanging fruit for our auditors. So these aren't always the most common audit findings, but they're still very important for us because they can still result in findings if we are not careful. So the first one is effort reporting and certification. So personnel or effort costs account for about 2/3 of the direct cost on all federal awards across the board. So things like late certifications, repeated recertifications, an effort that's reduced by greater than 25% without sponsor notification are definitely red flags. So if a transaction is selected for review and the auditor doesn't see receipts attached, this is going to the second one, the missing or insufficient documentation, and there's no reasonable explanation for how the expense benefited the project, they're going to question the cost and possibly feel the need to dig deeper and look at more transactions, which they can do. If we're making purchases, say near the end of a project, an auditor might wonder why and whether we're just restocking our supply cabinet or if we're just using up remaining funds. And if many expenditures have used the same boilerplate justification, like we just say items needed to complete the work, it's a signal to the auditors that we might not be paying close enough attention, particularly given some of the items our faculty legitimately need to purchase at times. Sometimes we have to go the extra mile to explain what they're doing and why. So that actually covered the second and third one, the boilerplate justifications, as part of the missing or insufficient documentation. Another really high risk area that can be a slam dunk for an auditor, and my personal favorite because it's what I do, is excessive or late cost transfers. So auditors are always going to look at late cost transfers, always. NIH has indicated that it is a barometer for the effectiveness of an institution's accounting and business systems. So if we have tons and tons and tons of cost transfers, especially late ones that are over our 90-day policy window, that is an indicator to the auditors that we don't have strong enough internal controls and that we are maybe not as strong as we should be there. Okay, so next is participant support costs, and these are commonly questioned. For example, if we're asking to rebudget these costs, have we requested prior approval? Prior being before we've spent the money on something else. Have we paid expenses for employees using participant support funds? If so, we can expect audit findings for that. What about allocation methods? So if we have a wonky allocation method out there and we've charged something to more than one funding source, we need to explain what we're doing. So we should always outline the allocation method used in these cases and ensure that they're reasonable, beneficial to both projects, and followed consistently. The next one is travel, which is always a hot topic. So can we always demonstrate effort toward the project for individuals who've had travel covered by the project? Now, some sponsors are okay with you not charging effort and charging travel if the person is mentioned in your reporting, if they are presenting something related to the project, that kind of thing. But you have to have some tie back to how this benefits the project. Did the travel directly benefit the project? Meaning there was training received or given or research presented at a conference, and have we followed all the rules, those being our own policies and procedures, and also things like the Fly America Act and all of that stuff that also applies to us when we receive federal funds. And finally, subrecipients, which frankly can be a minefield sometimes. We talked about monitoring a good bit already, but Have we documented our decision processes when we're determining whether or not a sub is high risk? And if we say they're high risk, do we have a plan for how to deal with that? It's not enough just to say, yep, this person's high risk, give them a subaward. We actually have to have a plan. And then we have to respond accordingly when someone does come back and show up as high risk. So the emphasis here is on documented. Now I'm about to date myself again. Does anybody remember the early days of the internet when the big meme was pics or it didn't happen? If it's not documented, then to an auditor, it didn't happen. So we have to make sure that we are documenting everything.
So mitigating risks. Once you've identified the highest risk areas for your institution, we need to start thinking about how we're going to mitigate those risks. So UG really relies on internal controls, compliance, and regular testing. The guidelines recommend compliance using a required program or effective business practices. And then, does our institution have a compliance program? Is it well designed and effectively implemented? If not, how or why? And then who owns the program and what steps are needed to correct the problems? Here at CSU, we do have a multi-pronged compliance program. I think program might be a tad strong word because that seems to indicate totally focused and everyone's on the same page. And we are on the same page. I just can't say that I would necessarily call it totally focused. So we use internal audit quite a bit to help us with that. We have the whole routing processes for all the workflows for things that need to be approved. That's part of this whole process. Brigette does some checks and stuff throughout her daily work and monthly. She's got different things that we look at. So we have a lot of things going on that to most people may not know exists. And they are intentional and they are generally cyclical. And we do them on various timeframes to kind of check all this stuff. And so then are policies and procedures published and accessible? Are they current? Are they complete? And then do we have regular training for everybody? Are the programs aligned with policies of the institution? So, if we don't have a policy that anybody even knows exists, like Brigette said, if you don't know it exists, you don't know where to find it, you don't know what it is, then it's really hard to be in compliance with it, but yet the auditors expect us to be. And so this is part of where, OSP now has kind of this list of all the policies and procedures that we point things to. But in general, we're using the FPIs that Business and Financial Services put out. That's kind of how we're using, that's basically our policies, even though they're procedures. That is what we reference because CSU is light on policies. So if you're ever questioning something like, what are we looking for? It's probably one of the FPIs. I don't know about you guys, but I definitely do not spend my nights and weekends reading all the FPIs. And so Campus Services is a great resource to ask kind of which FPI something might be in. I use them all the time to be like, do we have anything on this and what FPI is it in? So if you ever have questions, reach out to Campus Services to help you navigate all the FPIs. And then how often do you assess your compliance? Who's responsible for this assessment? Do you have a program to identify high-risk transactions and respond or mitigate? So a lot of the work that Brigette does is to look at our high-risk transactions. So she does do some stuff based on object code to help us kind of navigate through that. And then she'll do some checking to see if we're doing okay or if we need to look at some targeted training or some other ways to shore up our internal controls. And then if you identify an issue that you need to address, but you don't have the expertise in-house, reach out to your network. So we have in the notes, we talk a lot about NCURA. This CSU happens to be at NCURA, which is the National Council for University Research Administrators. CSU is a strong member in that organization. There are other organizations, there are other institutions. Really, there's lots of ways to get information. Definitely look at your source of the information. So, AI actually is pretty helpful these days to point you in the right direction. It is not the right answer necessarily, but it gets you in the right direction. So reach out, ask for help. Office of Sponsored Programs is definitely here to help you with that. I know sometimes we seem like we're the bad people and we're just telling you no, but in the end of the day, we really do want to help you get to the yes. And then just finally, if you're monitoring activities and are uncovering problems, then congratulations, everything's working. Like, we don't like to find the problems, and we all know hate when something pops up, but that really means that everything is working great. So,
especially if we're
right.
finding those problems in a timely manner.
Mhm.
And so as Kim mentioned, I do regularly pull data and look at things that like object codes that are unallowable, and to see if they're showing up in our 5.3 accounts. I look at things like purchases that are made within 3 months of end dates, or purchases that are made after, like outside of the project period. Things like teaching assistant tuition and salaries charged to 5.3 accounts. Or I know a lot of you have gotten emails from me about work study students being on federal work study and not being able to be charged to a federal grant. Lots of things like that. So I always seem to be in the business of annoying people, because I'll find these little things and say, well, okay, our internal controls are working. We're finding these things, and we're finding them quickly enough to be able to fix them within the window. So that's, I consider that to be a good thing when I'm able to send those emails out.
So when you've been chosen, who is the primary contact at your institution when an audit request comes in? And then I'm gonna go through some of the stuff, and then I'll kind of back and answer the questions for you. But and then who needs to be informed about the audit? It's really important that all the stakeholders are informed and know what to expect, and because we don't ever want anybody to be blindsided. They should be up to date and know exactly what to do when they receive requests, calls, etc. regarding an audit. So at CSU, the primary contact for audits related to sponsored activity is me. So I always need to be told, and then I will pull the team together that can do each part. Each audit is actually different. I have a core team, Brigette and Ben Egoff are my core team, but oftentimes we pull in a lot of other people to help, depending on the questions that are being asked and where the expertise lies. So the PI is generally informed, but if it's only financials, we rarely pull in the PI for the financial information, because it should all be available in our system of records. Then we need to prepare our people ahead of time. We do want to be truthful, honest, and forthright, but we don't want to hand over the entire financial system to an auditor or give them more information than requested. Faculty need to know this as well, and then stakeholders should always be in the loop, and should never be surprised by a visit or even a desk audit. This one thing about answering the question asked, I'll never forget this. Diane Preto, for those of you that have been around long enough, she used to be our OEO coordinator. She has the best example that I've ever come across. When someone asks you if you can tell them the time, we all, like, I would say it's 2:41. That would be my answer. But that is not the question asked. The question is, can I tell them the time? And my response is yes. And it's listening to the actual question asked, not what you think they want the answer to be. And it's, we do it by default. And until I had that example, I didn't really I knew it, but that one hit home. I think it's probably the best example I've ever heard. So we're not lying, we're not withholding, we're not doing anything, but we are answering the question that has been presented to us. And they will always come back with more questions if they need clarification. So never worry about that part. And then if you've been proactive, as we've talked about already, you'll be ready before you're even selected for an audit. And policies, procedures, financial data, source documents, effort reports, and workflow information is easy to locate.
Okay, so these are some examples of things that questions you might be asked, and what information you should provide in response. So you could be asked about equipment expenses charged to a department and grant accounts, and whether or not the allocation method was reasonable. So what you could provide in that case is the justification, including the allocation method that was used, which, if we've been doing it right, as we discussed earlier, should already be well documented. So all you should have to do in this situation is pull the purchase documentation, and it should have the justification in there that says This is being divided 50-50 because half of this equipment time is being used for departmental projects and half of it is being used for this grant project. And so, you know, it could be number of hours or number of samples that are processed or whatever, but that should already be well documented in a perfect world. And you just give them that. Next question. Your auditor might ask you, why were salary costs transferred 6 months after they were incurred? And I just see a typo on my slides. I'm sorry about that. As we said before, any cost transfer that's processed after 90 days, because that is our policy at CSU, will be questioned by the auditors. So we have to be able to demonstrate extenuating circumstances explaining why it took so long to complete the correction. So what we would provide in this case would be our justification, which should already be there, including those extenuating circumstances. For example, the entire administrative staff was out on medical leave and there was no one to complete the transactions for a few months, and then we had to catch up with the backlog and all of that stuff. Now, it's important to remember that workload in and of itself is not considered an extenuating circumstance. So we're understaffed and overworked. Yes, while that may be true, we are understaffed and we are overworked. That cannot be our standard extenuating circumstance, because if it is the norm, it's not extenuating, right? If our entire administrative staff was on the way to a meeting and got hit by a bus and was in the hospital for 3 months, that is an extenuating circumstance. A little extreme, but it's a good example. Late account setups, however, or extended negotiations are considered extenuating circumstances if they're properly supported. So if you have a late cost transfer where you're transferring effort 6 months after it was incurred or performed, one plausible thing that would be a good justification here is if there were extended negotiations with the sponsor and the account was set up in February for a December or November start date. So then you would have to go back. That's not 6 months, but you catch my drift. So you would have to go back to when the people started actually doing the work on the project to make sure that your effort is documented and recorded appropriately.
So one thing here at CSU that we prefer is to really get an advanced start instead of having costs sitting on a department account or something. If you know they're associated with a ward and it's just going through negotiations, or, you know, it's taking longer, that's when the advanced start is really a great option, because then we're not doing the cost transfers.
Yes. Good point. Okay, so here's another question you may be asked. Institutional policies require OSP prior approval for a cost transfer. Why is there no OSP signature on this cost transfer or approval in the system? So what you would provide in this situation would be an explanation of what happened, including the corrective action that was taken to ensure that it doesn't happen again. The important thing to remember here is, even if the costs would be allowable normally, if we didn't follow our institutional policies and procedures when we processed it, we could still get an audit finding, because auditors always question costs that have where we didn't follow our own policies, and they always question or look at cost transfers. That is a really important area to look at. So how would something like this happen? Well, what I've seen here at CSU is occasionally a PPDA will get sent directly to HR payroll, and they will process it before they realize that there's a 5-3 account involved and it requires an OSP signature. Now they'll send that back to me and say, oops, can you document this and approve it? And I would say 99% of the time we're able to do that. Occasionally we'll get them back and say, well, no, it's got to be, we have to do another one and reverse it because this can't be approved. And so those things do happen. It's very rare, thank goodness, because it's kind of a pain for everyone involved when that happens. But it's better to do that work than to end up with an audit finding. Finally, how do we respond when we receive the draft audit report? So we talked about the significant time lapse already that can happen between when all the work is done and the expenditures are made and when the auditor comes in to look at it. So it is possible for the PI, the key personnel, all the administrators to be long gone from the institution by the time the auditors arrive. So if there's not sufficient or clear or understandable documentation present in the financial system, you could find yourself unable to support the question cost. And that is someplace we do not want to be. Remember too that auditors, believe it or not, are human beings and they can make mistakes too. And just like us, just like faculty, just like any other human being, they may or may not have a good understanding of institutions of higher education, of certain types of research, all kinds of things. Now, they're not going to carry you off to jail because you forgot to attach a receipt, but there can be serious risks to the institution if we're found to have poor or insufficient internal controls. So auditors also don't always read or necessarily understand program solicitations and proposals submitted to funding agencies. So that's another thing where we might need to be able to step up and explain what something means. But it's important that they have all of the relevant information readily available to them. So they need to have those program solicitations and proposals. And if we need to go highlight things to show them how everything ties together, by all means, it's a great idea. They need to have access to annual reports and external reviewer reports, publications, internal project reports and findings, communications between PIs and the sponsor's program officers sometimes when you're talking about prior approvals and things like that. Things that have a significant importance to what's going on, what the transactions that are being audited. If there are institutional communications showing internal deliberations and decisions made prior to purchases, sometimes we have lively discussions about whether something is allowable as this kind of cost or not. And they may also need to hear testimony or communications from PI or program staff. Some do, some don't. It depends on the situation. But you will have, when you get the audit report, you will have the opportunity to discuss the findings with the auditor and come up with a corrective action plan, which will need to be submitted to the agency. Let's see. Oh, one thing I forgot to say, when we're talking about institutional communications and communications with PIs and program officers and things like that, emails or dated notes are way better than testimony. Why is that? Because they're static, because it has a date on it, because it's not reliant on memory. It's been put down in writing, and those things are always better to have than just a conversation.
Just one final thing on this too that I really want to highlight is that these are conversations with the auditors. So it is not, they don't come to us and say, here you go, here's all your findings. We do really have the opportunity to have respectful discourse and talk through it and, disagree with their findings. But it's also our time to build our case and tell our story about why we disagree. Terms and conditions change at agencies, and sometimes, they may be looking at a term or condition that's now versus what was in place at the time of the actual perceived infraction. So again, it's pulling all this data together and really telling the story and putting forth your compelling argument. I did not go to law school for reasons, but I feel like I've kind of started into that whole space of referencing things and pulling up stuff because it's so important to keep the institution moving forward about this is not what you think it is.
Right. And an example that we see a lot of times is we'll have auditors who remember how I said that your auditor may or may not understand how higher education works. We've had many times I've seen an auditor come in and say, well, you don't have timesheets on file for any of the staff or the faculty that were charged to this grant. And we think that's an issue. And we always have to come back and explain why we don't do timesheets for faculty and how our effort reporting system works and how all of that flows and how we have those internal controls in place to show and verify and re-verify what we're charging as far as effort. And normally that is accepted. And once they understand it, it's like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. It's a timesheet or another alternative method of confirming the work that was done and the time that was spent. But that is an example of something that almost always comes up. And so now is your opportunity to ask us questions. What would you like to know? Or are you asleep? Please don't be asleep.
Should we give them the example of my prudent person argument?
Yes.
Remember that one? We had an audit finding, not an audit finding, but a question cost. And it was for a computer, and they were willing to pay for the tower, but none of the peripherals.
I remember this one.
Because the peripherals were not part of the approved budget justification. But the budget justification said a computer to do XYZ things. And so we didn't break it down like tower only. So like they didn't want to pay for the monitors. They didn't want to pay for the keyboard. They didn't want to pay for the mouse, the extra RAM, all this stuff. And I mean, we went round and round with them. And so finally I ended up in uniform guidance. I love this word and it's the best thing ever. But in uniform guidance, it says, what would a prudent person do or whatever. So I ended up throwing that back at them. I was like, a prudent person would know that you need all this other stuff for the computer. And the computer, the tower with all the peripherals was less than what they had budgeted for the whole computer. So it's like we weren't even exceeding costs with this. It was under. So I take about 6 months and they finally agreed to cover it. But it was just fascinating to me that we're arguing over something like prudent person would understand that a computer is more than just a tower.
And you can't do anything with it if you don't have the peripherals with which to control it and look at the data. I think I remember that one. And one of the funniest things about it was that it was ordered as a single unit. And the only reason that they saw the peripherals at all is because the vendor on the invoice and the documentation that we had that came back listed everything out and itemized what all went into the computer, which I thought was hilarious because that was the only reason they decided to disallow the monitor and stuff.
So that's my personal favorite from CSU. We have some questions in the chat. So Jenny has asked, how often would an auditor have direct contact with department folks or PI? Pretty close to none. We do have sometimes where they'll talk to the PI, but in general, well, I take that back. We have 2 this week, so I don't know why I'm saying none, but if it's just over financial, it's pretty much never. If it's financial and programmatic, then OSP and stuff handles the financial part, but the PI and the department would have to handle the programmatic part. But we collaborate to make sure that we're all on the same page about who's doing what. And we usually are in attendance together to make sure that the right person is representing the right component of the audit. And so then Audrey is asking, how many audit requests does CSU receive a year on average? This year has felt excessive, and I'm saying calendar year. I'd say on average, we easily get 1 a month. Right now, I think we have about 4 active ones going since January. Most of the audits we get are actually from non-federal agencies. It's very rare that we will get a large federal audit. Those are more looking at CSU holistically. Most of the ones we get right now are programmatic. So.
And a lot of the ones that are really, really intense and want the most information are for your, $50,000 award over here, which I think is really kind of funny because it's the smaller sponsors that really want a lot more information sometimes.
And a lot of our audits come in they're used to dealing with businesses and doing contracts, not grants. And so a lot of the audit questions are basically irrelevant to an institution of higher education, but we have to translate for them to help them kind of understand why the question they're asking is not relevant to us, but here's the relevant component at CSU. That's one time where we probably do offer up more than what they're really asking, but it's to give them a comparable to because we know what they're asking. It's just not relevant to an institute of higher ed.
Thank you to Brigette and Kim for bringing this together. I always love the examples. I think those tangible things help us remember it down the road because you might not be in an audit specifically right now, but if it ever comes up, we'll be like, hey, that one time Kim said this about prudent persons.
It's not every day I get to use the phrase prudent person in communication. So
Yeah.
I was super stoked to be able to pull that one out of my pocket.
It is pretty awesome.
That CFRA really paying off.
Exactly. Well, I appreciate that all of you came and spent this hour and some change with us learning about the incredibly exciting topic of audit preparation. If you think of questions later, please feel free to send them to us. I would love to hear them and do some research for you.
Well, and we do take feedback and stuff that we hear from others to add in to make sure that we cover stuff in the future. This is a very common presentation that we get asked to do, so we definitely appreciate feedback so we can make it more relevant and practical as we go forward.